So let's start with what we are going to check during this workshop. And probably some of the things that we are going, or I'm going to talk about, you already know. But it's always good to go back a bit. So what is values? Values is just, we'll see what is the definition of a value, what is value actually means. We'll talk about value as a concept. Then we'll talk about value as structure. That means more about how can you structure your image with your values. Translated is going to be about depth in your image. Then we'll talk a bit about value as composition. This is also interesting to see how you can actually enhance your composition and take some skills that we learned from Andreas in the previous workshop, and then how can you enhance that. And the sixth part, there's tips and tricks. So what's here in the toolkit? We already know. The image is about color, value, and composition. So now we go for definition of value. So value basically is the range between light and dark. So this value scheme goes from white to black. We probably also all know of that. So we have white, highlight, light, low light, middle. That is like the middle value is like the 50% gray in our Photoshop table. And then high dark, dark, low dark, and black. These could be also subgrouped in high key. We'll talk a lot about high key and low key. So high key means like brighter values, and low key is darker values, and mid key. So these are kind of interesting, and we'll see later in the next chapter for the concept. How can you actually use these values as a base for your images? That is quite interesting. So value as a concept. So the interesting thing about this is like we have high key, mid keys, and low keys. And it's pretty interesting that we always talk about happy images or dark, moody images or like very neutral images. And we'll see in this workshop is also nice because everything is black and white. We don't really care about the color, it's just about the values. And even just the values, you'll sense a different emotion when you look at things that have like, for instance, high key or a low key or mid key. So in this painting from Arton Streeton, you can see that you have like a very kind of upbeating feeling to the image. Although you don't have any color, you don't have anything, but the statement or the feeling that it passes to you is like of more happiness. Like you feel a bit more happy when you see this image. Then, for instance, you see this painting for Caravaggio that is a low-key value scheme painting. It's also interesting when you want to go neutral, you go have this from Monet that you just have like very like mid-key tones in your image, and it doesn't really transmit something really specific. And what is interesting about this is like especially for ArcViz, so I was trying to compare always like painting or art with the ArcViz. It's quite difficult for us to actually have a value scheme because we want to show everything. We are showing the outside world. So I was trying to search examples of ArcViz related images to this topic. This image, taking the exception of the focal point, it's very similar to this one in terms of values. You just have like a value that goes from highlight to a middle, and that's it. So they control the value scheme in the image. And that makes also other interesting thing. If you make your palette of values shorter, the images is, of course, always as a standard, is more pleasant to the eye than if you try to cover the full spectrum of values. So that means sometimes we are just focusing and putting everything, highlights, darks, and that, and actually don't really need it. And it's quite interesting what Mir does. Is also just a mid-value concept that is enhanced very low key, that is the focal point. Like they choose one of these three schemes of high key, mid key, or low key, and then they, on the focal point, they just change. So they go brighter or darker. So in this one, they have like a very high key with very high level values, and then the focal point is like the shadowiest part of the image, so as the lowest value. And this one, they do basically the same here as Monet. It's like they have like a very mid-key level composition, and then they have like the darkest part or the lower key in the focal point. And the opposite, they do it here a bit like in the Caravaggio painting, where the highlight is actually, although it's not like a very high key level, it's like the highest one in the image as focal point. Here they do the same. They have like a very low, I mean, it's almost completely dark, but still you can understand all the shapes around it. And the focal point of this building is like the brightest part, or the highest value. So it's quite interesting that if you go back to the table and we start selecting from the beginning, like you talk with your client and they say, for instance, yeah, I really want a happy day. Maybe you don't have to use all the values in your palette. You can just choose like a very high key one and then go with a lowest value to enhance something that you want, like your focal point, for instance. So value as a concept, we can easily control, as we see later, the focal point, because we just have to go higher or lower, and the moods just by your values. Again, we have no color, we have, even the composition doesn't matter, but we can control like how we communicate with the viewer just by values. So after we understand that we can actually use values as a concept, we go now as value as structure, that maybe is the most common use that we give to values. This photo is from Rui Cardoso. I changed it because it's not black and white. It's pretty crazy good photos that he has, and they are all on film, right? So he just shoots on film. So this is also interesting to use as reference because the range that he has in terms of values is a bit bigger than the normal digital photo. And I took this as a reference because value as structure basically means foreground, middle ground, and background. We always talk about this when we do images. And this photo is pretty cool because you can actually see it gradient between what is your foreground, your middle ground, and your background. And if you don't have these three elements, everything is flat. What we say, oh, it's flat. Basically, being flat is like we don't understand the three-dimensional space of a two-dimensional image, in this case. So foreground, middle ground, and background are the structure that we should have, or we have to have, except for, I don't know, some abstract images, but probably even those, they need always to have this differentiation between elements. So we should always have our foreground, our middle ground, and background. In the foreground, we have high contrast and strong transitions. These value transitions. So it means that if we zoom here, you can actually read the detail. So you have detail, and usually you have, like you can see in the scale here, you have usually darker values and higher values. So we have like always like a big contrast between, as you can see here, for instance, in this part where is the mouse, or here, that you have like a very low value and a very high value. So that allows you to differentiate the shapes. And also in terms of blurriness, let's call it blurriness, is also interesting because the value actually says if something is focus or not. So if you have a foreground, you have like a very contrast between what is the highlight and the shadow. And if you go to the background, as you can see here, you almost don't see anything. You just see big shapes. So the foreground and the high contrast between values gives you detail. If you pass to the middle ground, you start losing the detail, but still you can understand, like you still have readable edges, although they are not that sharp anymore. So there's not like a high contrast between values. You still can read the shapes. And they start, as you can see also here in the scheme, the value scheme, that the values start to be dissipated. They start to be brighter. And when you reach your background, you always have like low contrast between values. They always almost seem the same. And you just see the main shapes. You don't understand more the leaves, like you can see here in the foreground. You just see like bunches of shapes that are together. It's just about the atmosphere in the air. So the atmosphere is like dust, is water, is a lot of elements that actually makes it into the human eye that it starts dissipating. And what is also interesting is not written here is like this depth element also changes according to the mood of the image. So you have a blue sky image like a summer day, the amount of depth is lower than if you have like, for instance, foggy is too easy, but like a cloudy day. So what does that mean actually for us as archivists, let's say? It means that we actually can first show the viewer that there's depth, there's a three-dimensional space in our image, and we can actually separate elements. Usually what we do is like our buildings are always like the middle ground, or like 50-70% of our images. So if you want to actually frame your building and you play with these factors of background, middle ground, and foreground, you can actually tell the viewer where it is placed in the three-dimensional space. And also other thing that is quite interesting for us, because we often have to place people or trees or other objects in the image, is like, if you understand how this works, when you do, for instance, a background for an image that we do it in Photoshop, you should be able to understand that maybe the values, they are not so different in between elements. So if you have a row of trees, maybe they are not, one is super dark and the other is super bright. No, maybe they are more constant. Instead, if you have something in the foreground, like we always use bushes or trees, we should give a bit more detail and a bit more contrast to the image. We can have this also is when we have, and we'll see in the tips and tricks, is like the Z-depth channel that we have that we can extract from our rendering. It's basically a CGI or the CG translation of what we can actually see here. So let's go back a bit. So we have definition of value, we have value schemes, we have value as a concept, we have value as a structure, and then we have value as composition. So one of the tools that we can have for value is value relationship. So this means that is like, as we saw here before in this mirrored image or in this one or in this one, although they have like a pretty basic value scheme, they always enhance it with a contrast, right? So value relationship basically is that. There's various examples, but this one from Plump is quite basic, I would say. Because if you see, they have like a very, like almost mid-key kind of composition, if you see as a concept, mid-key. And then bam, you just have like this Christmas tree that is clearly the focal point because all the composition is structured for that. And you just look at it, especially because the value relationship it has to the rest. So everything is quite neutral, but the focal point is quite bright. It's like the brightest point in the image, right? Like it's pretty easy to see. Another interesting thing in the value relationship, if you see like the sky, the ground, and the background, they are quite close in terms of value. But the elements that are actually framing the tree, they are quite dark. So that means what? In the value relationship, if you want to enhance something, you can just neutralize like the base of the image, like in this one, and then you can use, and we'll see that later with the framing part and guidelines, you can use like a more darker value to actually frame your element and then give it a high key contrast or high key value to actually capture the attention for the focal point. So this is always super basic. We probably have that in mind, but most of the times we don't use it. And it's quite easy to understand in this image. So this is actually in the value relationship, if you want to enhance something, you want to clearly show what is your focal point. It can happen that you want to integrate something in your image, right? That also happens with us. We have to work with photos and we have to match things. So composition-wise, you can also choose like this image from Slashcube that you cannot actually understand what's the project if you just see in value. So the value relationship can be the opposite. It can be used just to neutralize everything and make everything more coherent. So for instance, if you take a photo or the client sends a photo and you just don't want your building to stand out, you can just match the values and everything will be okay. So it's pretty interesting that you can use it or just to enhance, like clearly enhance your focal point, or just to melt and make it unnoticed, I would say. But what you can see also in this one is like our brain or our eyes, when you have like, this is a mid-level gray, this is a black, and this is a white. You feel, at least I feel, tempted to look at the white. I don't really care about the dark. So that means also when you want to use something like this, maybe the best strategy is to make the highlight on your focal point and then darken the rest. Although, for instance, in this image from here, that they have like a mid-key value concept, but they do the darkest point. But still, somehow, I want to look at the other part. Although this is the highest contrast in the image, and there's a human form and so on. But imagine if here it has like a bit of a highlight, probably your eye will go there. Taking this square as an example, and you take again a mirror image, you can see that the focal point, that should be the building, is actually very neutral in comparison to the rest of the image. But what makes it interesting is like they use the values to frame it. So you can see that the left part, the bottom, and the right part have darker values. And then they just use like a very high, it's not very high key, but high key level value to guide your eyes to the center of the image. And that's pretty cool because it relates a bit to this logic. So if you don't want to capture the attention, you can lower your value. But if you actually want to capture the attention, you should increase or go higher with your value. And again, to value relationship is funny because there's the deer here that could be like the focal point of the image. But actually, we don't really care because the value range is so, or the value relationship is so close that you are like, oh, light, oh, deer, oh, cool, oh, there's a house now. So it's pretty cool how you can use values for this. I was just trying to invert this because it's the same composition, it's the same value relationship, and actually the image doesn't really work anymore because your eyes don't want to be inside of the image, they just go outside. Of course, we also have like a white background and you can say that, or it's not a very natural type of values, but still, as the composition is the same, the elements are the same, just the values are inverted. And you don't want to follow more this darker value, it doesn't matter anymore. And these are actually not framing the building. So this is pretty cool. If you want to frame something and you want to keep the viewer inside of your image, try always, I know sometimes it's not possible, but try to darken your values. And if you want actually to make them interested about something, you just increase your values. So this is like the basics of values, I would say. And now there's some tips and tricks. And I just want to go quickly through that. So how can you check your concept, your values as a concept? You can check with the levels or your histogram with the levels or curves. It's the same. And here you can see there's a low-key level. This was taken actually from the images that are on the top. And you can see there's like, it doesn't go to black. In the mid-key, you have like crazy concentration of values on the middle. And in the low-key, like the right part is the brightest part and the left part is the darkest part. And in a low-key, you have the concentration of values on your left. So if you don't know how to read it, you can always put it like, even your rendering, you can check it from the beginning and know what you have to tweak. So other thing that is important is like, how can you check if it's, how can you check your values? So just put the black and white, hue and saturation, black and white, or choose the black and white option and put it on color mode. And here I explain why. So the thing is like, if we rely on our values to make our composition or our structure, and you actually start changing your colors in the normal mode, you will actually affect your values. So if you use hue saturation or color balance in normal mode, it will affect the values. So if you change it to color, it affects the color. Yeah, just affects the color. And also a cool tip that Leandro gave, that's pretty cool. That is like, if you actually, your values, like the curves and levels, if you actually change them in the luminosity, they don't affect the color, they just affect the value. So if you want to be really picky and precise in working with values and color, you should try to use these in these modes. So everything that is color mode, everything that is value is luminosity. Another thing that is also cool is like, sometimes it's difficult to read the image because it's, there's a lot of information, like the trees have a lot of information, the city has a lot of information, so it's important to make some abstraction. And for that, you can just collapse your image, make it in a smart object if you want, and go to filter gallery and have a cutout, and that will just simplify your shapes. So you can actually read that what is happening in terms of value, just in value. It gives like big chunks of value. So this one is just, this tower is a project. As you can see, like the value is pretty consistent to the rest of the image. So it's a cool tool. And that's it. If there's any questions.